Are you interested in understanding who or what fairies are and how to protect yourself against them? Well, you're in the right place. I'm Kitty, and this is Fairy Encounters. If there was ever an encounter with the fairy race to dispel their image as benevolent, harmless creatures, it's the one I have for you today from Newfoundland. This is probably the darkest, most troubling encounter with a fairy that I've ever read. But before I begin, there is something very specific about the fairies in Newfoundland that you need to know. Fairy sightings, encounters, and folklore are traditionally very strong in Newfoundland. The early settlers from Ireland, England, Scotland, and France brought with them not only their oral folklore, but the fairies themselves, who tend to be referred to in Newfoundland as the little people. They were considered to be a small race of supernatural beings in a recognizable human form who lived in the woods and rocks near the settlements and believed to be capable of helping or hurting local people. To understand what triggered the fairies in today's encounter into such violence and menace, we need to talk about the colour green. For still there are so many things that I have never seen. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. Tolkien. Traditionally, green has long been closely associated with fairies, but this connection is especially interesting in Newfoundland, where it was accepted as the colour of the fairies, and therefore not safe for humans to wear. It was believed by many that any person so bold as to wear green ran the real risk of, well, first of all, gaining the attention of the little people, which in itself is always a risk, but further, that they could take control over you, that if you wore green, they could compel you to do their bidding, if you will. And this wasn't just the chittering of a pocket of particularly superstitious or nostalgic folk. Green was considered such an unlucky colour that many Newfoundlanders of the time firmly believed that the St. John's Fire of 1892, followed by the bank crash of 1894, were caused because in each of those years the Newfoundland government issued green postage stamps, and so infuriating the little people that they retaliated. So, as you can see, this is complicated. What are we actually dealing with here? This is not some tricksy, meddling fairy. This is serious. These are fairy who claim ownership of the colour green and will punish anyone who dares to use it. Okay, so what might happen then if you know the fairies in your homeland claim the colour green, and whether it's through ignorance or recklessness, you get up one morning and you decide to pull on your green jumper? Well, let's see what happened to one man who did just that. In the early 19th century, a young man from a small Conception Bay community disappeared while crossing the Barrens on a visit to a neighbouring village. When he didn't return by nightfall, and another traveller reported that he hadn't reached his intended destination, a search party was organised. They made a thorough search of the area, but not a trace of the missing traveller could be found. Then, exactly 7 days after his disappearance, the missing man returned with a very strange story to tell. He told his friends and relatives that he had been kidnapped by the little people and held captive. He had been about halfway across the barrens, he said, when he stopped by a small brook to take a rest. Being a warm day, he took off his coat. This was his undoing, for underneath the coat he was wearing a bright green sweater. I was just sat resting, smoking a cigarette and gazing up at the sky, he said, when suddenly he found himself surrounded by a large group of tiny people, less than a foot high, and they were all dressed in bright green. They danced around him, pointing to his green sweater and chanting a strange song. And that is when I made my second mistake, he said. He sat up and asked them what they were doing. "Welcoming you to the little people," said one of them, who wore a kind of leafed crown and seemed to be their leader. The traveller protested that he had no intention of joining them, but the dancers all pointed to his green sweater, and the leader asked why he had come to the fairy dancing place wearing their colour if he didn't intend to join them. I replied that I didn't know that the spot there by the brook was one of their dancing places, and that wearing green in the world of mortals didn't have anything to do with wanting to join the little people. They didn't believe him, and since he was wearing their colour and had spoken to them, he was totally in their power. Despite his violent protests, they led him along a path to their underground dwelling. Here he was seated on a stone, and they began to work on persuading him to join them. First, a beautiful young woman came to him, singing and playing sweet music and trying to persuade him to become one of them. I refused, feeling certain if I had said yes, I would never return to the world of mortals. Then the little people, he said, became very, very angry. He was stripped of his clothes and chained to the stone on which he had been seated. Then the whole population of little people pelted him with mud and rocks. To prove that he had been chained, the traveller showed his ankles and wrists, where the chain marks were still clearly visible. After being showered with stones, he was punished by having water flung in his face by a gang of small fairy urchins. He endured the punishments as best he could, saying, "Then what appeared to be their leader came to me and threatened terrible punishments if I didn't agree to join them. The man still refused, so he was left chained to the rock. All night he remained in chains, and in the morning they brought him food. He was nearly dying of hunger and reached out his hand to take some bread when an especially ugly-looking little man standing beside him whispered in his ear, 'Don't eat it. I was like you once, but I ate their bread and can never go back to the land of mortals.' So the traveller refused to eat, and for a whole week he was kept chained to the rock and subjected to torments. Mocked and made fun of, he began to grow faint from lack of nourishment. At the end of a week's stay, the leader of the little people ordered that he be flogged with fairy switches for daring to wear their colour, and then returned to the world of mortals. The whipping was carried out with whips of thorny bushes. I thought I would die there and then from the pain. To prove this torture, the man pulled up his shirt and showed his back, all covered with cuts and bruises. When the whipping was finished, a fairy man shaved him, and he was taken to a nearby stream and thrown in. His clothing was then returned, including the green sweater, and he was led back to the brook from where he had been kidnapped. The man slowly recovered from his ordeal. The bruises and cuts on his back healed over, but he carried the scars of the fairy whipping until his death. Sometimes he could recall pieces of the strange music he had heard while among the little people, and in his twilight years he would play the sweet haunting melodies that he had heard on his whistle. Now, can I suggest you just take a moment to let that sink in? This is some pretty serious stuff, and there can surely be no better example of why we should take fairy folk seriously. There is an element of this poor fella being in the wrong place at the wrong time and in the wrong jumper, but to take a balanced view, he was aware of the risk and did it anyway. It's lucky that he survived that experience at all. I can't help wondering what they would have done with him had he agreed to stay with them or had eaten their food. I can't imagine that it would have been anything good. And do the little people of Newfoundland still feel so strongly about humans wearing the colour green? Or was it not about the colour green at all, and more a punishment for the rebellious act of going against fairy wishes? Perhaps the most important thing for us to take away from this encounter is just how fierce fairies can be. They can be physically strong. They can be vicious. They can be calculated and take pleasure in inflicting physical, mental, and emotional pain upon a human. But in the society of little people that poor fella encountered, I'd like to think there were a few who argued for mercy or for his release. Remember, fairies are individuals. They're not all the same, and we must always consider them with respect and caution. Thanks so much for being with me today. I know this has been a really dark encounter, so if you need something a little lighter, check out the video on screen now. I think you'll love it. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!